What up, nerds? So, I'm in the process of making a video on Monster Hunter Rise. It's a more negative video, but I don't intend it to be stirring up shit, shall we say. I want it to be more of a discussion-based thing, and I came across this video by HandiTips Gaming that really allowed for more elegant discussion. So I would like for people in the comments to refrain from shit-slinging. That's not going to help any kind of conversation whatsoever. HandiTips Gaming, if you're watching this, don't mean any ill will in this video. Like I said, I think it's just interesting to open up a discussion. I hope that you don't just dismiss my points. I hope that you think about them a little bit more. I hope more people think about things more, because the more thinky you do, the better you get at, well, pretty much everything. The more you understand the game, the better you get at playing it. The more you think about game design, the better you get at game design and all that sort of hunky-dory stuff. So let's hop right into this.
It was pretty much inevitable that this was going to happen. As soon as the Rise announcement came out, and the fact that it was going to be a Switch exclusive, there was bound to be immediate comparisons and plenty of bias in people to come out, whether it was for Rise or for Worldborne. In this video, I'm going to explain why it really is pointless to be comparing Rise and Worldborne.
Right. Okay, first of all, text needs to stay on just little couple frames longer, maybe. So, the idea is stop comparing Rise and Worldborne, which from the perspective of someone like me, is a really bizarre statement to make. You see, Monster Hunter at this point is, I hesitate to say divided into two camps. It's more like divided into two styles of Monster Hunter. You have classic style Monster Hunter, which is Generations Ultimate and older, and then you have new style Monster Hunter, which is Worldborne and Rise. It's the newer style of Monster Hunter that Monster Hunter is going for. Rise is a new style of Monster Hunter, and the only other new style of Monster Hunter game that exists is Worldborne, so of course there's going to be direct comparison between Rise and Worldborne. Are there things that maybe, you know, is not very good to compare? Yeah, graphical fidelity and frame rate and stuff like that. It's kind of hard to compare that stuff on a Switch compared to like a high-end gaming PC or a PS4 Pro or whatever. But as far as the gameplay goes, as far as the mechanics and the fundamentals, there's a lot more similarities between Rise and Worldborne than there is between Rise and like 4 Ultimate. You know, so these kind of comparisons are going to be natural, and I don't think they're necessarily bad. I think it's good to have this kind of general discussion. In fact, a lot of the stuff that's going to come up in this video is, I think, good for general discussion rather than just dismissing it as a non-factor.
Right now, let's get into it. Now, this one right off the bat has different levels of severity. I absolutely love the Nintendo Switch as a console, but I would definitely be lying if I said that it didn't have some limitations. It being a portable console has its pros and its cons. You're going to take hits with things like graphics, and frame rate definitely isn't going to blow you away by any means. Trying to put the Switch's hardware against an Xbox One X or PS4 Pro would be redundant. The latter two consoles are packing serious hardware in comparison. Now, to be fair, even on these more powerful consoles, getting a steady 60 frames was a pretty hard ask. But when we move things up another level, we come to the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. It's clear that these consoles are in another stratosphere, but hopefully we'll see the release of something like a Switch Pro so it can try to catch up a bit. With these next-gen consoles, you're getting stark 4K 60 FPS gaming. With just about any game, that's already going to look gorgeous, and we all know Worldborne is a different breed, so it looks beyond stunning. But we're not done yet. If we take it to the final level, PC users are also able to play Worldborne, and I don't need to go into detail of how ridiculous your frame rate and resolution can be when you're playing on a PC. But all of that is to say that we have to judge the game by seeing how it performs with what's available to it. Don't get me wrong, Worldborne in 4K is absolutely stunning and very hard to beat, but have you played the Rise demo? The RE engine absolutely blew my mind when I first loaded up the demo and went off to take on a great Azuchi, and that's what we need to be doing. We need to be appreciating the astronomical leap that Capcom has taken from Gen U to Rise.
Okay, so I let most of that play for, well, a good like 2 minutes there, because I didn't really have anything negative to say. I already stated that, yeah, uh, Worldborne on PS4, PS5, PC, it looks amazing. Rise is on the piddly little Switch. It's got limitations on what it can do with its hardware. The thing that I wanted to talk about, though, is when he mentioned that comparing Rise to Generations Ultimate in the, well, graphical performance kind of area. First of all, Capcom's had more time to work with the Switch. They've had more time to work with the skeletons and the models and engines and all that sort of stuff. So they're a little bit more technologically advanced. There's more that they can do on the Switch. But second of all, Generations Ultimate is just a direct port of the 3DS. So it's kind of a little bit... I would say it's a little bit unfair to be like, oh, well, look how much better it looks than GU, because GU was a 3DS game. It wasn't a Switch game. It was developed for the 3DS and then ported over to to the Switch. Now, it's amazing that it runs on the 3DS, granted, but it is very similar to comparing Rise to Worldborne in the graphical fidelity sense of, like, Rise is only on the piddly little Switch, whereas World can be on the PS5 with, like, 4K resolution, 60 FPS. It's a bit of a, leaps and bounds in what the hardware that the games are on can do. And how much they can push that. Just thought I'd put that out there. It's not necessarily like a terrible point, it's not egregious, but it's something to be aware of. GU was a port of a 3DS game, not developed primarily for Switch.
If you put these two games side by side, it's immediately clear just how impressive Rise is visually. But that's the thing, no matter how impressive the RE engine is, there's always going to be a cap or a limit when we talk about the Switch's capabilities. It's redundant to compare a game on hardware that can run over 100 FPS in 4K to one that is pushing hard for 30 FPS in much lower resolution.
I'd agree with that point, but this is going to be a very similar rhetoric throughout the rest of the video for things that are a lot more theoretical. So I thought I'd just note that the crux of this video is going to be you can't compare Rise and Worldborne because they're completely different beasts. They're doing completely different things. It's either really difficult or just kind of pointless to do so. And I'm going to be talking about why that is not the case. But we'll get to those points when we get to them. For now, this is all about hardware. I haven't really got anything to say about this.
Still have to end this section of the video by saying bravo to Capcom, because Rise still looks and plays very well. Think about how many new things they've
Okay. Ye old text on screen. They're way too different conceptually. That is a really interesting statement when you consider that all of these games are part of the same franchise. They all have the same core gameplay loop. They all have a very similar design philosophy. And not even that, but you can compare things from games that aren't even of the same genre. You can compare resource management in a real-time strategy game to the resource management in a fighting game. You can go across genres. You can even look at resource management in turn-based strategy games like Monster Sanctuary or even Pokemon. Just because games are incredibly different doesn't mean that you can't take comparisons, and especially with games that are quite similar with Worldborne and Rise. I know they're not exactly the same, they're really quite different, but in terms of Monster Hunter, Rise is a lot more similar to Worldborne than it is Generations Ultimate. We'll get a little bit more into that later because he's going to try and counter that a little bit, but the idea that you can't compare Rise to Worldborne when they share so many qualities such as the ability to move while healing, the base camps, the ease of crafting, the like in terms of you have 100% craft chance all the time and you don't need that many items to do so, the guaranteed item locations, and the lack of loading screens between zones. I want to state that I don't think not all of those things are how should I put it? I don't think all of those things are bad, but those are all things in which they are similar compared to classic style Monster Hunter. Classic style Monster Hunter has none of that, right? Infinite whetstones, bug nets, fishing. Well, fishing's always been infinite, but bug nets and pickaxes. That's all stuff. Even stuff like the flash bugs, the paratoads. I think I saw a sleep toad in Rise. I didn't really get to play the demo too much. I'm sorry. We'll get to that.
Introduced to us with the Rise demo already. We have absolute game-changing things like wyvern riding that will shape how we mount monsters, how we handle other monsters intruding on our hunt, and more. The fact that we literally get to control a monster is a concept that hasn't even been a glimmer of a possibility in any entry.
This is where it gets weird. Before he moves on to this, we haven't been able to control the monster in this kind of way. Let's get a second take of that, because I want to isolate that.
We have absolute game-changing things like wyvern riding that will shape how we mount monsters, how we
mount monsters,
handle other monsters, and
shape how we... So it's affecting how we mount, how we interact with other monsters,
intruding on our hunt, and more. The fact that we literally get to control a monster...
We literally get to control a monster.
...is a concept that hasn't even been a glimmer...
We get to control a monster which hasn't been a glimmer of a concept. This is really interesting, considering in a bit he's going to look at the clutch claw in Iceborne, where you can hit the monster to get them to change directions, and then hit them with a slinger burst, which causes them to launch into a wall. I would consider that controlling the monster. It's not controlling the monster in the same way the wyvern riding is controlling the monster, but it's controlling the monster in a very similar fashion, in that you change its direction and then you launch it into a wall. I mean, wyvern riding literally has you launching monsters into a wall. These two things are incredibly similar. They're not the same. They're absolutely not the same. There are a lot of fundamental differences, but the idea of latch onto monster, launch into wall is the same. That's the foundation. But then...
of a possibility in any entry. Outside of Monster Hunter stories, but it seems...
outside of Monster Hunter stories. When this segment is built on the premise of you can't compare Rise and Worldborne because they're too conceptually different, but then you compare to a game that is of an entirely different genre, it shoots your argument in the foot. I'm not saying you're wrong. I myself compare the wyvern riding to Pokemon battles, right? But it's just very bizarre to me that two games of the same genre, of the same franchise, with a ton of similarities, shouldn't be compared because they're completely different on a conceptual level, but this game of a completely different genre, character action game versus turn-based strategy game, they can be compared because you both do wyvern riding, you both ride the monster. I think this was a really bad thing to bring up in the video. I can understand if it's just like a, hey guys, I'm excited for this game as well. I'm excited for this game. As long as Monster Hunter Stories 2 doesn't fuck up, it's going to be an amazing game because Stories 1 was amazing, outside of frame rate and render distance. But like I said, it kind of dismantles your own argument.
With the radio silence that they're not really caring too much about that franchise. The closest you...
Also, text needs to stay on the screen just a little bit longer. I'm going to keep repeating that for as long as it's an issue in this video. So, I apologize if it gets repetitive. It got repetitive for me.
You could really say is when you clutch onto a monster in Worldborne.
The most you could really say is when you clutch claw onto a monster in Worldborne. Like I said, I would say that's controlling the monster. You change the direction it goes into, and then you launch it into a wall. It's not the same kind of control, it's not the same kind of direct control, but it is still controlling the monster, it is still latching onto it and launching into a wall. That is something that you can directly compare. They're achieved in completely different ways, and they have completely different implementations and implications on the rest of the game. Wyvern Riding can be used to fight other monsters with it and do crazy damage. It can be used to traverse the map really quickly, whereas the Clutch Claw in this sense can only really be used in a short amount of time to launch a monster into a wall to incapacitate it. And then of course you want to use it to weaken their hit zone, because hit zones suck in Iceborne.
And give them a smack to change their direction before you launch them. And even then, it's still completely different in how you approach and execute things. Even exploring the maps in each game is quite different. With Rise, we have an introduction of Spear Birds that are going to have a bit of an impact, it seems, on how we approach things pre-hunt.
Yes, the way you traverse is different. We still have the open world, the lack of loading screens between zones, but in this game, of course, you can traverse all of that. You make your own shortcuts, whereas Worlds maps were a lot larger and had base camps that you could teleport to, because you kind of had to, because the map was so goddamn big and it was so intertwined. There was so many different ways of getting to the same place. So it's kind of interesting to think about. The Rise is more limited in the paths that you can take, but it's also more open in the sense that like you can just sort of skip a lot of the traversal by using the added mobility. There's not really anything to say too much about this, other than I think it's actually really interesting to see the mobility implemented in such a way that it affects the traversal. I like it less so in that you can use it in combat to run away from the monster. I think running away from a monster should be difficult, but to get into a fight, I think there's a skill gap to be had that can make it more interesting and potentially more expressive, but we'll see when the game comes out. It's one of those things that's very difficult to say until people have spent a long time with it. I also want to add that the ring collecting sound is a little bit too loud and only coming out of the left channel. I apologize for that. There's not really anything I can do about it.
We've seen the Spear Birds extend our health and stamina bars the more we collect. There's endemic life to improve our defense, decrease stamina depletion, improve our attack, and even affect the monsters and debuff them in ways. This amount of emphasis on endemic.
I just wanted to pause on this screen because, you know, text is going to disappear very quickly. Debuffing monsters. That's interesting. I really don't know too much about how it functions or how it's going to be like implemented. I guess it's kind of like status effects in that like, you build them up and whatever, but regardless. This is something that is going to be really hard to see the effects of until the full game comes out, because we don't know what kind of implication it's going to have on the end game monsters. When it gets to like speed running and like how effective it is and how the game is balanced around you being able to apply like blights to monsters, it's really difficult. This is like trying to figure out I'm not really sure what this is like. It has to be said, this is something that's completely new and different that Monster Hunter hasn't done. If it's implemented well, I've got no issue with it, right? That's generally my philosophy with any design decision. If it's implemented correctly and done well, why not? There are some design decisions that don't do that kind of contradict what the design philosophy of the franchise is. We'll get more into it. Again, this video is just warming up.
Life is another aspect we haven't really experienced, outside of a small spotlight in Worldborne. Moving on, we get to the Silkbind moves. Now, this is clearly a nod to the Hunter arts that we got to enjoy in Gen U, which, by the way, if you haven't watched part 1 of my Why You Should Play Gen U, you should probably do that after this.
I agree, it's actually a pretty good video.
Silkbind moves are straight up expansions of a weapon's moveset. You don't have to fill up gauges, you don't have to meet specific requirements until you use them, of course, then there's a cooldown. When you look at Worldborne, what would you compare the Silkbind moves to?
This is like the example of you can't compare this to something in Worldborne. It's very specific. The idea of comparing Rise to Worldborne is not you compare literally everything, it's that you compare the things that are comparable. Moving while healing, roll cancelling out of items, base camps, ease of crafting, stuff like that. Stuff like the wirebug mobility, obviously you can't really compare that other than maybe the swinging on certain like latchberries or whatever the hell. Right? And even that is like nowhere near what the wirebugs can do in Rise. There's nothing that can really be compared to the collectible buffs. There's nothing that can really be compared to the blights that you can apply to monsters other than like the usual status effects and Clutch Claw wound. And nothing that you can really compare to the wirebugs other than like some very specific weapon mechanics. So the only thing that you can compare it to is the Hunter Arts in Generations Ultimate. That doesn't make it any less appropriate to compare to Worldborne. And especially since Generations Ultimate is even less like Rise than Worldborne is. It's classic style Monster Hunter. These two styles of games are so distinct from each other that the community has given them two different classifications. Classic style Monster Hunter and new style Monster Hunter. Classic style Monster Hunter, there's loading between zones, you can't roll cancel out of items, crafting is a hell of a lot harder, there's no refilling base camps, if you forget to eat, you forget to eat, tough shit. Whereas in new style, it does the opposite of all of that. These are very distinct styles, and because Rise is a new style Monster Hunter game, the only other new style Monster Hunter game that exists is Worldborne, so it is naturally going to be directly compared, especially because it is the newest Monster Hunter release after Iceborne. You know, Generations was directly compared to 4 Ultimate, despite Generations implementing Prowlers and Hunter Styles and Hunter Arts and stuff like Hunter Drinks. It was still directly compared to 4 Ultimate because that was the game that it was most like, whilst also being its own new thing. You can compare Generations Ultimate with 4 Ultimate. They share the same healing properties, they share the same mounting mechanics, and just general traversal and control schemes. They share very similar movesets. They're naturally going to be compared, it's just that it does its enough new things that warrants its own merits that need to be talked about in their own way. Rise is in a very similar boat with Worldborne, because it's the game that came after Worldborne, and it is much more like Worldborne than it is anything Monster Hunter has done previously. But of course, there are things that can't be directly compared, much like how styles and arts in Generations Ultimate can't be directly compared to anything in 4 Ultimate, and mounting and Y-stones in 4 Ultimate can't be compared to anything in 3 Ultimate. And how swimming and the new weapons that were introduced in 3 Ultimate can't be compared to anything in Portable 2G. That's just the way this kind of stuff goes. There are going to be things that you can easily compare and things that you can't easily compare. So the point I'm trying to make is, yeah, there are things that are new in Rise. That doesn't make it any harder to compare it to Iceborne.
Closest thing that I could really think of would probably have to be the Gunlance's Wyvern Fire. You launch that off and then there's a cooldown before you can start to use it again. Even the actual movesets themselves have seen some pretty drastic changes coming in, looking at.
However, a lot of the movesets are directly comparable. The Charge Blade still has its slide attack, where you hold a direction with the analog and hit A or circle. It still doesn't use up its red shield when you do an ultra, and it still has the sword charge. The Switch Axe still has the axe power up where you spam wild swing and then you do an overhead attack, and you can still latch onto monsters when you've powered up your sword mode. There are things that you can directly compare, and of course there are things that you can't directly compare, things that you have to interpret on their own and isolate as a part of Rise specifically. But that doesn't stop you from being able to do that, because, well, you just isolate it and analyze it in the context of Rise rather than in the context of Worldborne, because obviously it doesn't exist in Worldborne, so you have to see how it exists in Rise. I hope I'm making sense of that.
At you, Hunting Horn. But other weapons like the heavy bowgun having charged shots and counters are pretty sudden turns for the weapon from where it was in Worldborne. This is what is prevalent throughout the process trying to compare Rise and Worldborne. It really is an apples to oranges conversation. If you looked at the Monster Hunter series,
Has to be said that the transitions between each of these segments is incredibly jarring. While this title is on screen, you're already talking about the subject of what the title is talking about. So, Worldborne is the first of its kind. This is actually a really interesting point in terms of it's the first of its kind, meaning that this is the first time that Capcom has tried to do a Monster Hunter like Worldborne. As a result, there are things that it got wrong, like with the Clutch Claw. And for sure, it's one of the most controversial Monster Hunters ever, right? Which, because it's the first, and Rise is the second, Rise, theoretically, should be better. The Capcom as a whole, should have learned a lot of lessons from Worldborne that they will be taking into Rise and improving upon. I mean, the lack of Clutch Claw and Slinger in Rise, and not being able to fast travel to camps, and there only being one camp, tells me personally that they've listened to a lot of the complaints that people had for Worldborne, and they're altering things while still trying to appeal to that audience.
And picked out what would be considered the black sheep, you'd be hard-pressed to pick any other entry but Worldborne. And don't take that as me as knocking it in any way whatsoever. I've never put more hours into a game, I've never had more fun, enjoyment, or gratification from a game either. Worldborne is literally at the top of my list, but I would be naive to say that it definitely took the biggest risk and made the biggest changes to the core of what Monster Hunter is than improved.
And that's one of the excuse me. That's one of the reasons why people don't like it that much, is because it's the game that took Monster Hunter and turned it into something completely different. It was like it took the core gameplay and it altered it and tweaked it in so many fundamental ways that the community has literally created two distinct classifications. I keep going back to this, but it's important to note. There are people who only like classic style Monster Hunter. I'm one of those people. That's where my perspective is coming from. Despite starting in World, I don't like World anymore. After playing Generations Ultimate for over 800 hours, I look at World and I look at all the things that it's done to change the formula of Monster Hunter, and I fundamentally disagree with a lot of those things. I only like classic. But likewise, there are also people who only like new. People who like both are a very small camp, and they're somewhere in the middle. So my fear for Rise was a game that would try to hybridize new style and classic style, where it try and meet in the middle, because then the only audience that it's going to appeal to are the people who like both styles, which, like I said, is a very small portion of the audience. Most people either just like classic or they just like new. It's hard for them to like both. But that's getting a little bit off topic. The point is, World, it was such a departure from Classic that the community has literally created two different classifications of Monster Hunter, Classic and New. That distinction is very important because it tells you a lot about what the game will do. It allows you to prejudge the game based on its said classification, much like how genres a way of prejudging a game. You know what a fighting game is. You know what a character action game is. You know what a first-person shooter is. You know what a real-time strategy is. You can make prejudgments off of these games based on the classification that has been handed to them. You can go, I don't like fighting games, I'm not going to play this, or I really like first-person shooters, I'm going to play that, or I might play that, I'm more interested in playing that. Rise is a new style Monster Hunter, and as such, I'm not interested anymore. I've played a little bit of it, I understand what it's doing differently, I understand a lot of the intricacies that it's trying to accomplish, but I'm personally not interested in it. I hope that it's amazing, I hope it's better than Iceborne, I hope it's better than whatever the hell, you know, because the better it is, higher standards, rising tide raises all ships. I want better games, I don't want bad games, but I'm in an unfortunate position as a classic style fan where I want more classic style games and I want less new style games. I'm not going to play new style games because I don't like new style games. But then if new style games don't perform well, will that mean that classic style games will suddenly start cropping up? Or will they just continue trying to push new style? Or will they end up trying to hybridize? But if new style does really well, are they going to continue to ignore classic style? There's no clear answer to where I want of how I will get what I want out of Monster Hunter, other than I'm not going to buy a game that I'm not going to play, and I'll just keep playing Generations Ultimate. It's a bit of a conundrum for someone like me, but sidetracking aside, back to the video.
Previous titles. Some of these changes were great when it comes to the quality of life things, such as the radial menu, but these changes all really lead to the conclusion that Monster Hunter World was truly the first of its kind. It's really hard and honestly of little value to try and take this entry and put it side.
Oof. Okay. We're gonna have to take this piece by piece.
It's really hard and
honestly
of little value
it's hard and not worth it
to try and take this entry and put it side to side with the others.
It's really hard and of little value to take Worldborne and put it side by side with the other games. I mean, first of all, you understand why there's the two classifications. It's because World is such a departure, but that doesn't stop it from being able to compare to previous games. We can look at what it means when you can't move during a heal. It means that you have to be careful about how you heal. When you can move while healing, and if you can roll cancel, it means you are allowed to be less careful with when you heal. These are things that you can directly compare and analyze in terms of this game does this system like this, and it turned out in this way. This game did it this other way, and it turned out like this. And then you do that with all the systems. You piece them together, you find the design philosophy, you find what the foundation of the game is supposed to look like, and you look at all your systems and you go, does this help or hinder the system? Monster Hunter is a game that wants you to think about what you're fighting. It wants you to pay attention to the monster's movesets. It wants you to try and be better. These monsters are very damaging. They're very scary. They can kill you very quickly if you're not very good at fighting them. It rewards you for pattern recognition. So if you can only heal when there's a big enough opportunity to do so, it forces the player to recognize when there's a big opportunity to heal so as to not get punished during it. In World, however, because you can move whilst healing, and because you can roll cancel out of it, you don't need to worry about it as much because it's harder for the monster to punish you for healing. You can get away with it more easily, ergo you think less about it, and as a result, the emphasis on pattern recognition is diminished. You can see these direct effects, the contrast between how classic style Monster Hunter handles its healing and how new style Monster Hunter handles its healing. Looking at the design philosophy of the game wants you to recognize the patterns of the monster and go, well, classic rewards you for paying more attention to the attack patterns of a monster, with the heal, whereas World, you don't need to recognize the patterns of a monster in order to heal. Now, obviously, in both instances, more pattern recognition from the player is going to be more advantageous. You're going to be able to get the safer heals off, you're going to be able to get more damage in, but it's nowhere near as mandatory.
When you look back, the biggest shakeup prior to this was probably underwater combat, but even that was short-lived. Scout flies were introduced, clutch claw mechanics, brand new armor systems, layered weapons, open maps, and
Not really sure what layered weapons have to do with anything, because you can compare them directly to the layered armor, which can be directly compared to the transmog armor in Generations Ultimate, and why we can't transmog weapons is beyond me, so they finally implemented it, hooray. But just because each of these games have unique systems doesn't mean you can't compare them. You can compare the hunting horn in 3U to the hunting horn in 4 Ultimate to the hunting horn in Generations Ultimate. They change with each system. They change different properties, like the one in 3 Ultimate has underwater properties, the one in 4 Ultimate has mounting properties, and the one in Generations Ultimate has styles and arts to contend with as well. But overall, you can look at what the fundamental design philosophy of the hunting horn is and see how well it was implemented in these 3 games relative to what those 3 games do. In Generations Ultimate, it's fairly weak because all the other weapons are so goddamn powerful. In 4 Ultimate, it's also fairly weak because of all the power that all the other weapons have. In 3 Ultimate, it's not as powerful because of all the other weapons, but it's actually one of the better underwater weapons. It's got good range, it is fairly fast, it's got good utility. All of a sudden, the hunting horn in 3 Ultimate is actually not that bad, you know? But that's within the context of 3 Ultimate underwater stuff. Obviously, the underwater hunting horn can't exactly be compared to the mounting or like any style hunting horn in Generations Ultimate, but you can look at the weapon as a whole and be like, it had this level of power and utility. In this instance, it performed this role particularly well, it performed that role slightly less well, like it was good for support, but it was bad for damage, it did decent exhaust and okay KO, you can cut tails with it if you really want to. There's nothing to stop you from being able to go into all of these systems in all of these games and comparing them to one another, like how hitboxes are handled, for example. In Freedom and Freedom Unite, hitboxes are terrible. They've only been getting better, right? You can directly compare them and go, well, this game has terrible hitboxes and this game has great hitboxes. It's a little bit unfair to be like, this 15, 20-year-old game has terrible hitboxes. What were they thinking? But you could also, like any other system, you know, Exhaust, when Exhaust was introduced, Tigrex was a monster that was implemented before Exhaust was implemented, right? And that meant he was constantly running around, and the only time he stopped running around was when he did his bite taunt, where he did the small growl and then the chomp chomp. That was how the developers essentially implemented a break in his non-stop attacks to be able to give the players enough time to be able to do some damage to him. Exhaust comes in, he still does the nom-nom, but now he has a bigger window in how you fight him because of Exhaust. As a result, you can do more damage to him in that amount of time, and as a result, maybe the health pools of monsters gets increased. These kind of changes throughout the series have implications on the way the rest of the game is designed. If you can do more damage to a monster thanks to an implementation like Exhaust, then maybe the health of the monster needs to go up. If you can increase the damage you're doing to a monster because of Clutch Claw, maybe the health of the monster needs to go up to compensate. Maybe the hit zones need to be made weaker. Maybe the monster needs to be able to counter your ability to Clutch Claw onto them. In Rei Zhang's case, it's all 3.
and so much more. When we have a sequel to Worldborne, the comparisons will be much more garnered and
Rise is technically the sequel to Worldborne. It's not Worldborne 2, but then Generations Ultimate isn't 4 Ultimate 2. but it is still the sequel to 4 Ultimate. It's the successive game, the game that came after 4 Ultimate, right? It's technically a spin-off game. Yeah, sure, it's technically, but it is the game that released after 4 Ultimate, making it a direct sequel. And it was the first game to not have a number, so, you know, now we're in a situation where we have Generations Ultimate, World Iceborne, and then Rise Ninja Valley. I don't know. We've kind of lost the numbering, the numerical values of sequels, because World is technically Monster Hunter 5, but it's not Monster Hunter 5, it's Monster Hunter World, so it's technically kind of a sequel to 4 Ultimate, except it's the game that came after Generations Ultimate, so it's kind of a sequel to that. And Rise isn't Worldborne 2, so it's not technically a sequel to that, but it is a new style Monster Hunter, so it's technically the sequel to whatever the previous new style Monster Hunter is, which is Worldborne, and it's also the game that came after World. Monster Hunter's kind of in a bit of a predicament when it comes to its sequels, but the point is that Rise is the game that came after Worldborne. It's the same style, as in new versus classic, or new compared to classic. I don't want to make it like, oh, new versus classic, one or the other. It's literally just Rise came after World, which is a new style of Monster Hunter game. Rise is a new style of Monster Hunter game. We're kind of going down this path of logic here. It's not a numbered sequel, it's not a direct sequel, it's more like a spiritual successor like Dark Souls to Demon Souls, but it is still the game that came out after Worldborne. And because it shares the style, and it shares a lot of similarities, it's going to be the one that gets compared all the time. Halo 4 is the game that gets compared to Halo 3 all the time, or even Halo Reach, depending on which like release chronology you want to go for. It's compared to previous titles, right? Despite it being made by a completely different team and it having a completely different like visual style and mechanical style, it still gets compared to previous games because of what those previous games did really well and what Halo 4 fails to understand about why people like Halo. But we'll get onto that later because I've got something much more poignant to say.
Actually worthwhile. Till then, it's a waste of time.
Actually, until it's actually... Hold on. We gotta double take that.
Layered weapons, open maps, and so much more. When we have a sequel to Worldborne, the comparisons will be much more garnered and actually worthwhile.
When we have a sequel to Worldborne, they'll actually be worthwhile. Oof. Why would the comparisons not be worthwhile now? Why are the comparisons between Worldborne compared to Freedom Unite? Why are they not fucking worthwhile? Of course they're worthwhile. Like, any general kind of discussion comparing any kind of system, even from different genres, can be worthwhile. Like, how you manage your resources in a real-time strategy versus a fighting game, a turn-based strategy, first-person shooter, character action, RPG, whatever the hell, like, that baffles me. That really baffles me. Why would it not be worthwhile to compare certain elements of Rise to Worldborne? Why would it not be worthwhile to compare elements of Rise to Generations Ultimate? Because if you can't compare Rise to Worldborne, you know, the game that it is the most similar to, then there's absolutely no way you could be able to compare Rise to Generations Ultimate, because it's not a sequel to Generations Ultimate. It's not a sequel to Worldborne, it's not a sequel to 4 Ultimate, it's simply the next game in the line, at least from what you're putting across. It's the game that came after Worldborne, which is the game that came after Generations Ultimate, which is the game that came after 4 Ultimate. All of these games can be compared to one another in some way, shape, or form. It's very contextual on what you can compare. Obviously, like, comparing the graphical fidelity, like, well, it's something you can do. It's not like the most substantial thing that you can do. There are more important things at play. You know, like when you're playing a video game, the most important thing is the game. Sure, graphics make it look nicer, it can make it play nicer and feel nicer. It's the cherry on top. It can take a game from a 9 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10, or vice versa. But it's not the most important thing to discuss. You talk about the mechanics, the gameplay, the fundamentals, and you can directly compare that because they all use the same core fundamental philosophy of how the monsters interact with the players. This is something that I'm going to be going much more in depth with about in my Rise video. But for now, it's important to talk about the mechanics of any game. The better you understand the mechanics, the more you can draw from analyzing them, the more you can think critically about how these games change over the years, in what ways they should and maybe what ways they shouldn't, because there are certain things that you just should not implement into Monster Hunter, you know? Like, if you had literally infinite healing and it was instantaneous, that would be bad for Monster Hunter. It hasn't done that, but it's done things that kind of almost get there, but we'll talk about that later. Maybe not in this video, maybe in my own topic video, but it is something important to consider. There are things that Monster Hunter just shouldn't have, and analyzing and understanding the mechanics that Monster Hunter is fundamentally based on is very important in understanding what should and should not be in a Monster Hunter game. And in order to do that, you need to compare the mechanics from when it was implemented really well to when it was implemented really poorly, what the differences were, why they were implemented well or poorly, and what it says about the design philosophy of the game, the fundamentals, the core ethos of what Monster Hunter is, and maybe how you can add things in the future that don't directly contradict that. This kind of stuff is important. Just general discussions about mechanics and design philosophies is beneficial to the discussion of any game. The more you understand the game, well, first of all, the better you get at the game, but also, like I said, the better you can understand the effects and implications of certain mechanics. And doesn't that just benefit everyone? I don't know. I feel like I'm going around in circles here.
Till then, it's a waste of time and breath at this.
Waste of time and breath. Evidently, by the length of this video, I don't think it is. I don't know, maybe that's just because I'm a games designer. I'm a games designer, I'm a gameplay first kind of guy. I absolutely love talking about mechanics. I'll talk about mechanics of any fucking game. I don't fucking Pokemon, Borderlands, I don't fucking know. I find that stuff fascinating. I find it intriguing. You're understanding the backbones, the DNA, the building blocks of these games. Why would that be a waste of time to discuss, man? Like, these are the things that make these games. You don't have a game without these things. Why would they not be cool to discuss? Why would it not be cool to compare this kind of stuff? Why? This is a very similar kind of thing that's happened in Halo, and even in Pokemon, where you have like this divide between the fan base of like one group prefers the classic style and one group prefers the newer style. But the thing that unites them is the discussion of the mechanics and their implementations on the franchise as a whole, and whether or not they should be there in the first place. Halo has been split down the middle thanks to a single implementation, a single goddamn mechanic that has had such a drastic change on the entire game. The way that every game has been designed moving forward from the release of Halo Reach and onwards has been completely altered because of sprint. One mechanic, one simple thing, put down gun, move faster. That has completely altered the design philosophy and ethos and has completely warped the backbone of those games. It's important to discuss these things because not everybody understands them. The more you know about a subject, the more you can talk about a subject, and from my perspective, the more interesting the subject becomes. Why is it not interesting to delve into the whole Halo sprint debate to understand why some people like it and why some people don't? Why is it not interesting to inform yourself more on the design decisions of the designers at large, to be able to put yourselves in their shoes, to think, what would I do? How could I possibly innovate Monster Hunter without sacrificing its core gameplay? What would I do? How would I implement these sort of things? These kind of thought experiments are genuinely entertaining to me, but I also find them a really interesting talking point, something you can discuss with other people. But not only that, if you're discussing with them with other people on the internet in large enough quantities, maybe the developers take notice and maybe they start implementing some of these ideas themselves, because not every developer knows their game back to front. They don't necessarily understand the implications of certain mechanics. They simply add them. Case in point with Gigantamax in Pokemon. I don't think Game Freak really understood the implications of giving every Pokemon the ability to essentially Mega Evolve with Z moves on a 3-turn limit. It essentially turns PvP into whoever uses Gigantamax last wins. Whoever KOs one of their opponent's Pokemons first wins, just because of how the maths of you only get one Gigantamax and it lasts for 3 turns and they're super powerful. You have to use them on your last turn, because if you use them early and someone waits you out, or someone stalls you with like Protect or Fly or Dig or whatever, you've wasted your only Gigantamax, and now the opponent can use their Gigantamax free of charge. They don't have to worry about when they implement it anymore, you know? I don't think Game Freak really understood what Gigantamax meant for Pokemon, but people on the internet sure as shit did, and there's been many a discussion about that. And back to the Halo thing, there's been many a discussion about Sprint in Halo, and it's led to 343 Industries trying to incorporate a Halo game that will appeal to people who like the Sprint, but also the people who like the classic style of Halo. These two separate camps. You got classic Halo that was made by Bungie, and new Halo that was made by 343 that has Sprint in it. These kinds of discussions are always valuable. To dismiss them as it's just a waste of breath, man, that really rubs me the wrong way. It really, really rubs me the wrong way. And I personally could never understand that idea. Why would it ever be pointless to talk about a game's mechanics when the mechanics are what make the game? When a game could always be better with the implementation or removal of certain mechanics. Why would the addition of this mechanic be good? Why would it be bad? Why would the removal of this mechanic be good? Why would it be bad? Why would it be a good idea to alter backstabs in Dark Souls 1 so that instead of just hit the attack button on your opponent's back, you have to kick the opponent's back? Why would that be good? How would that affect everything else? Would that be a good balanced decision? Would that be a good decision for the game as a whole? Would it make the game better? Would it sacrifice any core implementation of its design philosophy? Would it contradict its theming or world building or anything like that? All these other things that can have an effect. Dark Souls is a fantastic example of a game where the mechanics are kind of married to the world building and the story elements of it. So changing certain aspects of it can have serious consequences on the way that the world building and the story is experienced. This stuff is so important. It's so goddamn important. So to call it a waste of breath, holy shit, dude. That is very... It makes you seem like you're putting yourself on this pedestal. It makes you seem like you're trying to put down people who care about talking about mechanics. I don't think any of that's true. I want to make that clear. I don't think any of it's true, but it's what it makes you look like. So I advise that you avoid that kind of stuff in the future.
Point. Speaking of sequels, if you want to eventually compare two titles, go for the direct iteration that it's actually the sequel of. The team behind the absolute solid port.
Oh boy. The sequel that it is a direct sequel of. It's not a direct sequel of Generations Ultimate, because if it was, it'd still have Styles and Arts. If it was, it'd probably still have, well, everything that Generations Ultimate did. It can't move while healing, loading between zones, I don't know. But the point about it's the same team, you're grasping at straws here. It doesn't matter if it's the same team. Dark Souls 2 is the sequel to Dark Souls 1. Right? That's the way it goes. Despite Dark Souls 2 being not only made by a different team, but directed by a completely different person. In case you don't know, the director of Dark Souls 1 is headed as the creative genius of the game, responsible for all things good, regardless of whether that's true or not. That's the perception. So Dark Souls 2 not having this director was a really bad thing. It created a game that was, let's just say, controversial at best. But it is still the sequel to Dark Souls 1. I don't give a damn if it's a different team. The sequel to Halo 3 is Halo 4. Despite 3 being made by Bungie, and Halo 4 being made by the incompetent 343. Right? These are direct sequels despite being made by different teams. It doesn't matter. And the point about it being a sequel to GU than Rise, or Worldborne, sorry, that is really, really grasping at straws. They've never, as far as I'm aware, they've never stated that this is the sequel to Generations Ultimate. If it was the sequel to Generations Ultimate, we should expect styles, arts, and fucking prowlers. But none of those things are in the game. The closest thing we get is the wire bugs, which, as we've talked about, whilst similar to arts, are nothing like arts. Styles, wire bugs are on a cooldown, whereas arts are based off of you building up meter by damaging your opponent and other mechanics tied to your style. Right? Which art you select is up to you. You get a list to choose from, and the number of arts that you can select is tied directly to the style that you're using. And the styles themselves completely change the moveset and functionality of a weapon. You get to choose how your weapon functions, and it changes how it plays. Whereas in Rise, your weapon has a static moveset with static wirebug attacks. They are always the same for every single player. You can't swap them in and out. If we're talking just features alone, that is a direct downgrade from Generations Ultimate. I don't necessarily agree with that statement, but that is what we're looking at here, which is really interesting considering that when you compare it to Worldborne, there are more things that it keeps the same. There are things that it removes and replaces entirely, but there are more things that are similar to it than there are things similar to Generations Ultimate. The only goddamn thing that is similar between Generations Ultimate and Rise is the wirebug arts, and as I've said, they're not the same at all. They're very different. That's the only comparable thing. Meanwhile, between Rise and World, they're both new style Monster Hunter, moving while healing, fucking ease of crafting, base camps, or yada yada yada. The skeletons, the lack of loading between zones, the flash bugs and paratoads. To call it a sequel to Generations Ultimate is a bit of a stretch, mate. Bit of a stretch.
Generations Ultimate are the same team that have been working on and will be releasing Rise. What we've seen in just the demo alone has shown us the massive improvements they've made, and not just in the form of graphics, even though Rise does look fantastic, but even from the combat, quality of life, and flow of the hunt.
The thing about the combat is very difficult to accurately state because combat is incredibly complicated. To say that Rise is an improvement over Generations Ultimate in terms of combat, I personally, as someone who's been delving really deep into the mechanics and design fundamentals of Monster Hunter, I would disagree with that statement, but it's really hard to make that definitive statement. In terms of quality of life, yeah, there's a lot of quality of life in Rise. That's kind of just the nature of it being a newer title, so I can't argue with that one.
A lot easier to make a comparison and come to a conclusion when the game was literally meant to be an improvement from it.
Yeah, it's much easier to compare and contrast, much like how it's easy to compare and contrast apples and oranges, which is something that you state that Rise is to World. but it's also, you know, significantly beneficial to compare things to the previous entry. The previous entry from Generation Ultimate to 4 Ultimate, the mounting is identical, the skeletons are identical, loading between zones, majority of items are identical. A couple core systems have been changed, like actually using a demon drug now gives you additional attack even after you've eaten for attack up. But there are still differences. There's still key things to change over. The addition of prowlers, the hunter arts and styles. That's exactly the same thing as Rise to, or Worldborne to Rise. You know, the removal of Y stones and Apex monsters. The whole frenzy system. You know, frenzy only exists in 3 monsters in Generations Ultimate. You got Gormagala, Shugaru Magala, and Chaotic Gormagala, right? They're exclusive to those monsters. They can't be contracted by any other monsters. The whole labyrinth system and like the somewhat randomized gear, you know, leveling up your apexes to 140 double Rejang, you know? That stuff doesn't exist in Generations Ultimate, but you have Deviants, that's different, that's new. It seems very silly to me to compare Rise to Generations Ultimate very willingly and very freely, but refuse to compare Rise to Worldborne when they have a lot more in common.
Obvious correlations between Rise and Gen U. For example, look at the hunter arts in
Pretty much the only thing that you can compare between Rise and GU, I might add, and as we've spoken about, they're fundamentally very different.
Gen U, and tell me that doesn't directly lead to the implementation of the Silkbind moves. See, now there's a slight change up since you don't have to fill a bar to use the Silkbind moves, but we know where they came from. Hell,
we also know where Exhaust came from. It came from Tigrex having a pause in his animation. What's your point? Like, yeah, wire bugs take a lot of influence from hunter arts. They're not the same thing in any way, shape, or form, other than, hey, your thing's off cooldown, time to use it. But what about, like, all the other things? What about the base camps? What about the healing while moving? What about being able to roll cancel out of items? Where did that all come from? Infinite whetstones, infinite bug nets, and pickaxes? That all came from Worldborne. There's a lot more things. Where did all the movesets come from? The ability to use an ultra on the charge blade without using up red shield. The ability to charge your sword with the charge blade. The ability to increase the what's it called? The part breaker damage that the axe mode does in Switch Axe. The ability to charge up sword mode. The ability to latch onto monsters in sword mode. Where does that all come from? That all comes from Worldborne. So to say that Rise has nothing to do with Worldborne and comparing the two is completely pointless. But then, in the same pace, be like, but it's actually the sequel to Generations Ultimate, and the only thing you can do to compare the two is grasp at straws. It's incredibly... Oh, I want to use the... I don't think it's good. I don't think it's a good idea. It makes the comparison seem very, very shallow. You know, when the only thing that you're comparing is the wire bugs and the hunter arts, despite them being a massive difference between the two, it makes the comparison very shallow. But then to reject the comparisons between Worldborne and Rise that are also shallow, and some of them a little bit more in-depth, what are you doing? This doesn't make any goddamn sense. You're shooting your own argument in the foot. And I know a lot of people agree with your video. It's got a very positive like to dislike ratio. Conversely, I imagine this video is going to be the opposite because any gaming opinion I have seems to be wrong. This whole video seems to be a very desperate attempt to... I don't know. You're desperately trying to do something here, and I don't know what it is, and I don't know what the point of it is. Stop comparing Rise to World Iceborne. You haven't told me why it's bad. You haven't told me why I can't. All you've done is try to compare it to GU while only grasping at straws, shooting your own argument in the foot, and just generally confuse the tits off of me. I don't know what this video was. This video was supposed to be like, hey, let's not compare Rise to World, but it didn't do any of the things that it needed to do to convince me of why comparing Rise to World is bad, why I should stop doing it, and why there are other things that maybe would be a better use of my time. If you tell me that talking about mechanics like this is a waste of time, I'd like to remind you that discussions of game mechanics like this literally benefits everyone. The more intelligent people are, the better everyone gets, right? The more we understand these mechanics, the better we understand the game, the more we can, you know, come together as a community to try and create the games that we want to see, that have the mechanics that we want to see, that have the implications that we want to see. You know, maybe we can communicate to the developers a little bit better to be like, yo, this aspect's really cool because it does this, this, and this. That's a really cool interaction that you've implemented. And then developers are either like, damn, they noticed that really cool thing we implemented. Or they're like, wait, that did what now? Oh, damn, that's cool. We didn't even intend for that, but it caused this. That's cool. We're keeping that. Like I said, developers don't always know the implications of their mechanics. I don't think Capcom really understood what it would mean to be able to move while healing. 343 sure as shit didn't realize that adding sprint to Halo would cause such a ruckus, and I'm sure Game Freak didn't realize what a hubbub fucking gigamaxing, maxing Pokemon in, well, Sword and Shield would do. So having these general discussions informs the developers of what we're interested in, and then they can work towards making better games. The thing with the whole marketing of a lot of games, with stuff like Halo and Pokemon and even Monster Hunter, it's very easy to tie a new feature or mechanic to something that's very visual. You push a button and you do this. Easy to sell to people who are either hardcore fans or just casual observers. You push this button, you put your gun down, you move faster. What a revolution. You hit this button, your Pokemon go big and then go burr. You hit this button, you latch onto the monster, you've started mounting them. Except now, you're doing Pokemon battles in Monster Hunter. It's wyvern riding, baby. That stuff's so easy to display to people who don't know shit about these games, right? It's very easy to be like, oh shit, this couldn't be done in these previous games, that must make this game new and cool. But to people like me who really care about the fundamental mechanics of the game, this stuff just poses so many more goddamn questions than it does answers. It makes me go, well, how the hell are they going to balance this? How the hell are they going to, you know, balance the knockdowns versus just being able to spam one button to force knockdowns? Like, what's going on here? How is this going to interact with the rest of the game? You know what I mean? So for people like me, I'm much more interested in the stuff that's like, hey, we sped up the starting frames of this attack, or we decreased the damage value on this attack to help incentivize use of this other attack. We decreased the range, we made it so you can still toggle escape, but also not be able to chain backstab in Dark Souls PvP, you know? All of that sort of stuff. You can still dead angle, reverse roll, all these cool little things. They're all nifty. Except it's better. I don't know, fucking... I don't think this video was given the time that it really needed to formulate. I think it really needed some more time in the oven.
Some of the Silkbind moves are nods or direct ports from some of the different style mechanics as well. The Dual Blade Silkbind move is literally the adept dodge from Generations Ultimate. The Sword and Shield Silkbind move is Round Slash with a fresh coat of Rise paint and flare added to it. We should be talking about the astronomical improvements they've made from Gen U to Rise. Loaded zones to full open maps,
Ooh, boy. Loading zones to full open maps. I can see you haven't been hanging around in the loading screen debate all that long. It's not a direct upgrade. Never has been, never will be. The thing is with the loading screens is the disadvantage is you can get booped into the next zone. What's the disadvantage between having physical spaces between the maps? Is that if you want to create a shortcut, you have to create the physical space of the shortcut. With a loading screen, you can literally just pop a little dotted line from zone 2 to zone 9 or whatever. You fade into a loading screen at zone 2, you end up in zone 9. You don't need to go around the whole thing. It's a lot harder to do that with physical space. Still possible, but there are more limitations as opposed to, hey, I just added in this dotted line so you can jump from zone 1 to zone 12, and from zone 3 to zone 7, from 2 to 9, from 4 to 11, I don't fucking know. But not only that, fighting monsters when you're being pinned into a corner is not really a lot of fun. I think most people can agree with that. When you have physical spaces between zones, that shit's gonna happen a lot more often. You get cornered at the edge of a zone and you start getting pushed into the corridor. Monster's enraged, it's gonna fucking chase you. Now you're having to fight a monster in a narrow-ass corridor. Right? Neither one of those is ideal. They both have advantages and disadvantages. The physical space makes the place feel like a more realized area, whereas having loading screens between zones allows you to make an area more fantastical. Look at the desert, the original desert, like the Freedom Unite desert. That place feels huge, bro, but it's not really that much bigger than Verdant Hills or the dunes from 4 Ultima, but it feels huge because it uses that open space, it uses the locked zones to be able to create the illusion that you're traveling a huge distance. You can see something off in the distance, a mile away from one zone, travel through a loading screen, and then you're there. No extra traversal required. As a result, you can create these spaces that just feel gigantic, you know? It's not a case of you remove loading screens, replace them with physical zones, and it instantly becomes better. That's not how that works, right? There are advantages and disadvantages to both.
Absolutely hating your life while you're climbing up Zone 6 in the Verdant Hills, to literally being able to pull out a giant bug and being able to cover ridiculous amounts of ground.
Okay. Finding climbing a pain in the ass in previous games is subjective. Enjoyment of using the wire bugs and advanced mobility in Rise is subjective. Climbing just is clunky in Generations Ultima, but I've also heard people say that it's the wire bug climbing is really clunky in Rise, and from the limited playtime I've had of it, I too felt it was clunky. You can prefer one over the other. You can enjoy the climbing, you can enjoy the wire bugs. That stuff is just personal preference. To paint it as you will hate the climbing in Generations Ultima, but you will find the wire bug stuff incredibly freeing in Rise, I would consider it to be, well, you're very brazenly painting one as bad and one as good. You're trying to immediately sway your audience into agreeing with you. I guess I would call it bad faith. You're not giving both sides of the argument breathing room, essentially. You're not having the merits of very limited mobility versus very advanced mobility. After all, the more mobility a player has, the more power they have. The more power they have, the harder the game has to be to compensate. It's the exact same thing that happened in World Iceborne, right? The player had incredible power, and as a result, the game had to catch up fast, resulting in a shit ton of one-shots and touch-of-death combos that a lot of people really didn't like. A lot more raid boss mechanics, because they literally had to time people out, slow down fights, increased health to a gigantic magnitude because they gave the player too much power. But that's going to be a topic that I'll talk about in my Rise video, so I'm not going to waste any more time on it. right now, unless it comes up again later.
The introduction of this massive amount of vertical movement itself is mind-blowing, and for them to do it so effortlessly and in such a polished state is something that gets overlooked, mainly because people are still mad over it being a Switch exclusive.
Jesus. Jesus. That is incredibly dismissive. You didn't notice this one thing because you hate this game. You don't understand it because you're bad. That's not an argument. People can be mad about it being a Switch port, but still admire the fact that, hey, they did these cool things. It's completely disregarding anyone who doesn't like that it's a Switch exclusive. Just kind of almost labeling them as people to not listen to. And it could be taken further to people who don't like Rise. I'm not saying that's what you're doing. I'm saying that's what it looks like you're doing.
These are the comparisons that should be being made, the two games that are actually directly connected.
The two games that are directly connected, Rise and Worldborne. They're both new style Monster Hunter games. Rise came out after Worldborne. Oh boy! This one's going to be fun. The game isn't even out yet. You've already been hearing me rant a lot about talking about mechanics and the fundamentals and just like the theoretics of game design, right? This is stuff that hopefully by now you can understand that I don't need to play a game to be able to analyze it, but I have preparation. I have, in fact, a script ready for my Monster Hunter Rise video. We zoom in on it a little bit. Make it a little bit easier for you peeps at home to read it. So, obviously this video is intended to come out before Rise actually releases. As such, I knew I was going to get people being like, you can't talk about a game you haven't played. So I prepared a little thing. So, if you'll indulge me, because of the timing of this video and nature of the title, I want to dedicate some time to explain why it is possible to judge games without playing them. And to do so, I'm going to don my best pseudo-intellectual hat and talk about narratology and ludology. This is specific to the video. So, narratology and ludology. To put it simply, narratology is the idea that you can learn how a game plays, functions, and even its qualities and shortcomings solely from second-hand accounts, as in reading about the game and listening to what other people have to say about it, a way of judging a game without playing it. Ludology is the opposite, saying that the only way to understand a game is to play it, and no amount of reading and second-hand information will give you an accurate picture of the game's quality. The truth is obviously a mixture of the two. I don't need to play a platformer where the jump button only works 50% of the time to be able to conclude that it is a bad platformer. However, unless I try to perform an alleged difficult combo in a fighting game, I will never truly understand how difficult it is to perform. All I can say is, everyone else says it's hard, so it must be hard. The combo is an example where the tangibility of pressing the buttons plays an important part of understanding its qualities, whereas the platformer is an example of something that does not need the tangibility of pressing buttons to understand it is bad. Its quality is something that can be concluded entirely with theoretics, as in understanding the implications of a button only working 50% of the time. This kind of thing can be scaled into more complicated things, such as the addition of the base camp in Monster Hunter. Obviously, with the increase in complexity from an implication standpoint, it makes dissecting the mechanic and understanding the interactions it has on the rest of the game a much more difficult task, but not impossible. You can absolutely 100% without a shadow of a doubt analyze parts of a game without having to play it. This is something that is talked about in academics. This is something that was even a goddamn debate in like 2005, a very short-lived debate, because like I said, the truth is a mixture of the two, where people are like, hey, you can only understand games if you play them, and other people are like, nah dog, you can totally understand everything about a game just by reading about it. Like I said, truth somewhere in the middle. If you look at a game's theoretics, the fundamental design philosophy, the core of the game, the DNA, the building blocks, you can look at that stuff and it is incredibly theoretical. It's incredibly mathematically based, right? There's very little about it that is tangible, that you can actually say things about, that can only be talked about because of its tangibility, because of the way that you press buttons, the way it feels. Most of it is built on the way it is, the way that it functions, very quantifiable things. Understanding a game's systems takes time and effort. It's not exactly the easiest thing on the planet to do, especially the more complicated systems in more complicated games. The implications of sprint is not necessarily is not necessarily that easy to understand. It's possible, but it takes time, right? You have to understand how it changes the maps. You know, the lines of sight get changed, the map gets stretched so that you get to the same place in the same distance. You understand that the time to kill has to be improved so that you can't just escape from every gunfight. The aim assist has to be improved to accommodate for the movement speed of the player, the bullet magnetism as well. You have to understand how it changes the verticality of the game. If you can clamber up a ledge and the clamber height allows you to jump further, then the verticality has to be increased. If you don't have that, the verticality gets shortened, but there are other ways that you could have the same verticality but with different map layouts. This kind of stuff is all theoretical. It's all stuff that you can think about. Just put your mind to it. Even if this game isn't out yet, I can still make definitive statements about it. I can still say that the way that healing works is going to be detrimental to the design philosophy of Monster Hunter as a whole. Woof. It's incredibly dismissive to say that you can't talk about a game that you don't know enough about. You can't talk about a game if you haven't played it. There's a reason why prejudgments exist. There's a reason why classifications of games exist. It's because they can give you an idea of how these games play without having to play them yourselves. There's a reason why reviews exist and why they're popular. There's a reason why there are some videos that criticize games in excruciating detail, talking about the bare bones of the goddamn mechanics, the very spine, the skeleton of the game, and people find it interesting. Even if they haven't played the game, these reviews, these videos and criticisms can give us a good understanding of how the game functions, how it plays, how its mechanics intertwine with one another, without having to play it ourselves. So don't even. I am running out of patience, partially because this video has been going on for so goddamn long, partially because I've watched this video twice to make this response.
Honestly, I probably could have just started here and been done with the discussion altogether, but chances are if you're
Negativo, because we've talked about that, you can understand a game without playing it. But moving on, this article's, well, kind of bad. I haven't read it all. I only saw this screenshot and read a little bit of this, that, and the other, and was like, hey, it bad. And it lacked a lot of information.
watching this video, you've already seen my video on the absolute shit article that was made about the Rise demo, like it was a full-blown version of the game.
For all intents and purposes, demos these days are full-blown versions. Even betas are full-blown versions. We can't really make comments on the quantity of content, but we can talk about the quality. That's generally what demos are there for. They're to showcase the highest quality of the game, to get you to go, damn, this game is quality as fuck, let's buy it, you know? I make it sound like it's really sleazy, but it's not. You want to put your best foot forward, you know? But yeah, we can't really make an accurate statement of the quantity of Content, we can't really make an accurate statement about motion values or armor sets, just because that stuff could change before release. Hell, it could even change post-release, you know? We live in the world of live services. An armor set that has, like, attack up large could get changed to have attack up medium and crit high small, you know?
This is what it looks like to me anytime someone is trying to legitimately argue that Rise is better than Worldborne, or that Worldborne is better than Rise.
You can totally do that. Again, going off of the theoretics. Going off of ye old narratology. Guy makes me sound like such a pseudo-intellectual whenever I talk about that stuff, but I can't help it. I was literally taught this.
It's a bit worrisome seeing some of the clearly trash takes that I've seen coming from the inside of the community.
Oof, you're probably not gonna like my takes on this game, huh? Feel like it's important to state again. Not here to cause a shitstorm. I've been getting progressively more aggressive in these responses. Again, I'm starting to lose my patience. There's not really much I can do about that. I don't mean ill will. I don't want people to be like, oh, this man, bad, boo! You know? I hope people don't do that to me, but like I said, my takes are generally very contradictory to the community's take, so there'll probably be a lot of people in the comments going, boo, get this guy out of here. But we take those. The intention of this video was not to call shit. It wasn't to say you're wrong for liking this game, but it was more to like open a discussion of like, here's some interesting things that I don't think you've thought about. If you do think about them, then hooray! More thinking, more thinky, better shinky.
A community that I absolutely love and have had nothing but positive experiences with. I mean, we all see what's going on in the world today. It's your team against mine, and I don't care what the take is. If it's coming from the side that isn't mine, it's automatically bad. And
I'm getting this is a joke. I really hope that people in the comments don't do this. Like, seriously. I really, really don't. I don't want that. Again, that's not what the point of this video is. The point of this video isn't like, ah, you like new style, boo! It's like, you clearly like new style, you've got things to say, let's listen to what the things you have to say are. I disagree with this, that, and the other because of these reasons. I'm gonna explain it why. And hopefully, HandiTips, if you're watching this, hopefully you have taken it well. Hopefully you haven't taken it too personally. I know, like, response videos, generally speaking, are like, oh, someone made a response video? Oh god, I'm getting attacked. No. Please, don't do that. So, all I can say is, this video is made in good faith.
And that's the most political I'll ever get, so I do hope you enjoyed that. But I'm seeing the cracks in the foundation where teams are starting to form between Worldborne hunters and hunters from the 4U, Gen U games, and of course eventually Rise. It's
like I said, it's because there's a distinct classification between classic style Monster Hunter and new style Monster Hunter. And you included Rise with the GU camp. Bro, that ain't classic, that's new. Keep it with the World Iceborne camp, please. But that kind of tells me something. It kind of tells me that people who like both are viewing this game as a hybrid of new and classic. Even if they don't consciously acknowledge that, that's what they see it as, which is really bad for Rise, because people who only like classic, we ain't going near that shit. We don't want to touch that. What is that? There's a new style Monster Hunter. Oh, and new style hunters want to play new style games. They're generally on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. Not all of them are going to have a Switch, not all of them want to get a Switch. Even if they do, they might not necessarily want to play Rise because it does certain things differently from Worldborne. That's how preferences go. I think it was the worst case scenario of Rise trying to hybridize, because as I said, if they try and cater to both camps, they're going to end up catering to neither camps. They're only going to be catering to people who like both styles. And people who like both styles, it has to be said, I imagine they would have bought the next Monster Hunter regardless of what it is, because it has Monster Hunter slapped onto the title. Not saying that they're like super hardcore fanboys who, you know, are like that, but if it's got Monster Hunter in the title and it plays somewhat like Monster Hunter, they're probably going to enjoy it. And hats off to them, they can enjoy a hell of a lot of different Monster Hunter games, whereas I'm limited to only enjoying classic style, of which there are not that many that have good online these days.
It's really not that hard to enjoy both of the games and the different branches of the Monster Hunter tree they may fall in. Want to see that in real life? This comment from Shady Fungus is a fantastic mind.
Okay. The only reason I won't buy Rise is Prowlers aren't returning. Exactly! Why aren't Prowlers returning? Prowlers are so cool! They're sick as fuck! Look at them! There's 15 weapons. Is it 15th? Yeah, I think it's 15th weapon. Prowlers is a 15th weapon. Come on, Capcom, make it happen. The mechanics and gameplay look extremely well polished. I played the crap out of the Switch version, beating all seven... Wait, what? That broke my brain. Beating all deviants, 7 that can one-shot you with a Prowler, and man, I hope they get to return, but I'm sure they won't. Still, I wish nothing but success for this game. Well-reasoned argument. Well, well-reasoned comment in general. I won't be buying this game because it doesn't have this feature that I really want, but it looks good, and I hope it's good. I'm pretty much the same, but on a much more complicated level. There's like a million things that Rise is doing that I don't like, but I hope it's good. And I hope that this is the sort of mentality that people can get behind. It's again, it's really complicated for someone who's a classic style, because we want more classic style games. Rise is not a classic style game, right? But what do we do about that? The only thing we can do is vote with our wallet and pray that another classic style Monster Hunter gets released, but there's no guarantee. There's absolutely no guarantee. There was no guarantee that Monster Hunter Stories 2 was going to come out. You know? So it's really hard for us. But enough boo-hooing. We still get to play GU, right? We still get to play GU. It's all good.
Mindset. I promise it's not hard to have that mindset either. If you think Rise is already better than Worldborne, that's baseless.
It's not baseless. Iceborne has the Clutch Claw, which is almost universally hated. Rise does not have the Clutch Claw. People who don't like Iceborne, there are people who like World but don't like Iceborne because of the Clutch Claw. And the Clutch Claw itself, I mean, how many discussions are there out there that talk about how the Clutch Claw fundamentally changes the game and how it contradicts a lot of the stuff going on in Monster Hunter? It really changes how the game not only plays, but how it's designed. Monsters have crazy high health pools with terrible hit zones, and as a result, offensive sets are incredibly incentivized, which means that defensive sets are incredibly de-incentivized, especially considering how high the survivability in Monster Hunter World Iceborne is, because you can move around whilst healing and roll cancel out of it. It means that monsters have to either one-shot you or give you touch of death combos, making defensive sets absolute worth shit, because monsters can just kill you so quickly anyway, and because the amount of damage that they are required to kill, you need to have offensive sets. Why do they take so much damage to kill? Because they have increased health pools and terrible hit zones because of the Clutch Claw. That kind of design all stems from the introduction of the Clutch Claw. Rise doesn't have the Clutch Claw, people see that as a win. It's not baseless. Rise could be worse than Iceborne. It could be better than Iceborne. We don't 100% know as of right now, because there's so many more factors that go into a game's quality than just the absence of the Clutch Claw. But from what we can tell right now, it's not baseless to say that Rise will be better than Iceborne.
If you think there's no chance that Rise will be able to meet or surpass Worldborne in quality, that's also baseless. We have an extremely small sliver of Rise, so making any kind of broad statements just doesn't make any sense.
It does, and I have explained why.
We have 4 monsters in a roster that's easily going to be over 10 times that. We have weapons that we have very little data on, armor without actual skills, bowguns that don't have access to all the ammo they can use, and the list could go on and on and on. Being an elitist on...
I want to make it clear that motion values and armor sets are not what make a Monster Hunter game good or bad. They aid, but that's not the most important thing. I mean, like, from my understanding, it's like, healing, moving while healing, the roll canceling, crafting, all that sort of stuff. I got a whole video in the works talking about this sort of stuff. So again, I won't get too much into it here.
Either end of the spectrum just isn't the move. I
agree with that. Elitism, bad. Monster Hunter's no stranger to elitism, but that doesn't make elitism good. Elitism, still bad.
haven't played all of the Monster Hunter titles, so I can't say which is the best. I can say though that Worldborne is literally my favorite game I've ever played, and I hope Rise is even better than that. When these games succeed, the entire franchise succeeds, and that success breeds even better games in the future. But
that's the theory anyway.
That's going to be it for this one. After seeing all the Monster Hunter bad takes videos popping up,
Woof. I apologize in advance for my bad takes videos.
Felt like this video needed to be made. Part 2 of why you should play Gen U is coming soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that one.
I most certainly will. I imagine it's going to be pretty good. The first one was genuinely good. No jokes or irony here. It was good. I'm looking forward to the second one.
If you liked the video, please do feel free to let me know with that thumbs up. Comment down.
Alright, well that's the end of that video. So I'd just like to go back to this script of my Rise video, just to put a nail in the coffin of a certain topic. This video is not intended to dismiss those who are looking forward to this game. It is not intended to tell you that you are wrong for liking the game. It is intended as a complete explanation as to why I do not enjoy this game and feel that it fails in some key areas. I've met a number of people within the Monster Hunter community. Some are excited for the new release, others are more apprehensive. I also have made and plan to make more Monster Hunter content on the channel. As such, this video is partially made as a cohesive explanation of my thoughts on Rise as an easy reference point to whenever I'm asked what I think of the game, but also to maybe illustrate why many people are not interested. If you're someone who likes it, then maybe I can help you see the other side. And if you don't like it, then maybe I can help you understand as to why. After all, not everyone can articulate why they do or do not like something. This response video was made just as a short stop in between before I finished this video, this lengthy Rise video, but also as a kind of prelude as to what to expect. HandiTips, if you're watching this, I hope you stick around for this full video. I hope you'll find it interesting. I've put a lot of time and effort into formulating my arguments in this one and trying to be cohesive and understandable. It's not complete yet, obviously still work in progress. I want a better discussion about this. I don't want it to be a shitstorm. I don't want it to be name-calling or just hot takes being thrown at each other. I want it to be an in-depth discussion as to the qualities of this franchise and what can be done to improve upon them, and what is being done in Rise that I think contradicts them. I hope that this video was informative to everyone watching it. I hope that HandiTips takes something positive away from this, rather than any mean-spirited comments that I may or may not have made in the past hour and 42 minutes of this recording. So sincerely, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.